Charles Darwin, the great naturalist, Victorian gentleman, and evolutionary biologist, died in 1882 without the faintest idea how his great theory worked. He believed that all living things had evolved over millions of years through a process he called natural selection. Along with competition, it was this process that had produced us and the extraordinary variety of life we see around us. But evolution, through natural selection, is all about inheritance, the legacy that one generation passes on to the next. And just how that happened puzzled Darwin to the end of his life.
If you read The Origin of Species today, there are a number of surprising things about it. First of all, it's very easy to read. It was, after all, a popular science book. What's most astonishing about it is how up-to-date most of it seems. And that's true for all of it except for one chapter. And that's the chapter on laws of inheritance, which is a complete mess. He has no idea what's going on.
He says in The Origin of Species, in one sort of rather doleful passage, nobody can say why a character is sometimes inherited and sometimes not, and why a child will sometimes inherit a character apparently from his grandfather rather than from his parents, why a character misses several generations.
Darwin's theory of evolution had been over 20 years in the making and is still considered to be one of the great ideas of modern science. But by the turn of this century, it was all but discredited. Without a credible mechanism for explaining inheritance, it could be no more than interesting speculation. The key to Darwin's dilemma was, of course, what we now call genetics. Unknown to Darwin, two of his contemporaries had already taken the first steps towards resolving the problem.
The 1850s and 1860s were an extraordinary decade. There you have Darwin in his garden at Down, just outside London. You have Mendel in his monastery. And away in a laboratory in Tübingen, you have Friedrich Miescher extracting nucleic acid from pus cells. Now, at first sight, these three things have nothing in common with one another, and yet the three of them represent what a century and plus later has come to be realized the synthetic core of modern biology.
Miescher, with a microscope and pus drawn from the wounded of the Franco-Prussian War, identified the molecule we now call DNA. Gregor Mendel, in a monastery in Central Europe, was coming to some remarkable conclusions about inheritance in peas. Darwin's contribution was to provide the big idea, the overall scheme which might explain the complexity of life and how it came to be. Change was at the heart of his theory, gradual changes from one generation to the next, as the fittest and the best adapted survived and prospered, passing on these favored characteristics. But how were these changes passed down from one generation to the next?
He had a kind of mechanism where males and females produced little sort of spores in their blood called gemmules that mixed together as fluids, and the offspring were a kind of average of their parents. It was a sort of blending idea. First, it didn't seem to him much of a problem. He was wrong, of course, because let's imagine that one of the parents had some advantageous character favored by natural selection. Well, if that was passed on by dilution, then it would be just diluted out of existence over the next several generations. And that means that Darwin's machinery wouldn't work.
Uncovering the machinery of inheritance would take more than 100 years. It's a story of big ideas and laboriously detailed investigation, and a story of competition between scientific ideas, a notion that might have intrigued Darwin, who made competition the cornerstone of our understanding of evolution, and a contest that he was by no means always tipped to win.
Well, it's a very odd story, because Mendel's work was rediscovered around about 1900 independently by several different people. There's no question now that it's right, essentially. But it was initially treated not as a sort of a support for Darwinism, but actually as an alternative explanation of evolution to Darwinism.
Mendel was a monk, later abbot, of the Augustinian monastery in Brunn, a thriving provincial town in what was then a part of the Austrian Empire. Between 1856 and 1863, he raised nearly 30,000 plants, crossing varieties that demonstrated clearly identifiable characteristics, all the while counting the number of times each characteristic appeared in succeeding generations.
He did the thing which is absolutely essential in experimental science. He posed himself a problem which he knew he could answer. Science is the art of the soluble, and if you set yourself a problem that you really can't tackle, you're wasting your time. But Mendel very deliberately set out to look at hereditary patterns in a plant in which he knew that the hereditary patterns were actually rather simple.
What Mendel observed is, for example, if you cross a pink and a white-flowered pea plant, then all the offspring in the next generation are pink. So what had happened to the white? And that was the mystery that he started with. Now what happens if we cross two pinks in this generation? Well, that's when the famous ratios pop out in the next generation. You get 3 pinks and 1 white. Now, why is that the case? And Mendel was able to be clear that somehow the white had been masked in the middle generation, but it was still there, ready to pop out at the end. And this is what we would now call the pink being dominant, the white being recessive.
The essence of Mendel's idea is that inheritance is based not on fluids, but on particles. And of course he worked on peas. He worked, for example, on round or wrinkled peas. His amazing breakthrough, really, was to find, and it seems simple, that when you cross a round with a wrinkled pea, you don't get a pea that's partly wrinkled, you get a pea that's round. That pea, if you make those peas together, then you, in the next generation, get the wrinkled peas back again, quite unchanged. So that inheritance is a matter of separate units that are passed down the generations, quite distinct from that which they produce.
Mendel had uncovered a crucial aspect of inheritance. The fact that somehow an individual's characteristics, the color of hair or eye, for example, are passed on through the generations, sometimes showing themselves in a particular individual, sometimes not to be seen again for several generations to come. How, and just what this means for the way species might change over time, were of no concern to Mendel. But for Darwin, an understanding of the way inheritance works was critical.
Darwin's great idea of evolution by natural selection starts with 2 fundamental ideas, really. One is that like begets like. In other words, human beings have human children and horses have horsey children. And furthermore, big horses tend to have big foals and little horses have little foals. Like begets like. On the other hand, despite that, there is variation. Even peas in a pod are all very, very slightly different. Because you have variation, you have the possibility of selection. Some in any one environment are bound to fare better than others. The ones that fare better will be the ones that survive, the others go to the wall. If they weren't varied, that system just wouldn't operate. What Darwin has to explain in order that evolution by means of natural selection can actually work is why, on the one hand, like begets like, but why, on the other hand, all the creatures, all the offspring of any given couple are actually varied. And that's actually a difficult problem, and Darwin never got the answer to it. And he knew to the end of his life that evolution didn't work unless he had a proper explanation for how heredity works.
But Darwin's genius had been to ask the difficult questions about the complexities of biological change. He had been born into a world that believed every living thing was the handiwork of an all-knowing creator. How else could you account for the wonderful complexity of life? or for the fact that each creature is so marvelously adapted to the environment in which it lives. Any other explanation was too improbable for words. But Darwin was trying to unravel the improbable, to discover natural laws that would explain the world around us. Mount Improbable, Richard Dawkins has called it.
You have to picture Mount Improbable as a huge, great precipice, absolutely sheer, and on the top of it is sitting the most complicated piece of living organization you can imagine. For many people, it would be an eye. And the metaphor of leaping from the bottom of the cliff to the top of the cliff corresponds to that eye coming into existence spontaneously by sheer luck. And obviously it can't be done. You cannot leap from the bottom of a cliff to the top. But if you go round the other side of the mountain, what you find is a slow, gradual ascent. And it's very easy to get from the bottom of the mountain to the top just by putting one foot in front of the other, so long as you've got enough time.
This idea that life could evolve slowly but surely through natural selection into the complex forms we know today is as powerful now as it was 150 years ago. So how was it that Darwin got into such a muddle when he tried to understand the way inheritance might work? Imagine the young Charles Darwin, 22 years old, and off on the adventure of a lifetime as naturalist on the Beagle. It was from this experience that his ideas began to take form. During those 5 years in which he quite literally traveled the world, he was confronted with the overwhelming variety of nature, of new species undreamed of. But more than that, he began to be aware of the variations to be found within species. His attempts to explain the nature of this variation and its causes and consequences were to occupy him for the rest of his life. On the Galapagos, a group of islands some 500 miles to the west of Ecuador, he came across his famous finches, though at the time he didn't realize that they were all finches at all.
Well, I think Darwin must have found it extremely confusing. There is a group of birds here, some of which look very similar to each other, with just differing beak sizes, but others of which really look rather different. There are birds here that look like warblers, not like finches at all. There are birds which look like American blackbirds, icterids. So I think initially Darwin really wouldn't have appreciated that there was a large number of closely related forms at all.
On his return, Darwin handed the birds to the artist and ornithologist John Gould, who quickly identified them as a number of new finch species. The germ of a great idea was forming. Perhaps the birds had evolved from a common ancestor.
The logical explanation for this group of really closely related forms occurring in this isolated island group is that there must have been a common ancestor which has diverged in a number of different ways within recent geological time and become species. So species weren't eternally fixed entities. They could arise in recent geological time.
The Galapagos Islands, the remains of intense volcanic activity, rose up from the sea around 5 million years ago. Not long, as it turns out, in evolutionary terms. So in that time, could one species really have evolved into several? The idea that a species might change and new creatures evolve was not only shocking to those who believed in a divine creator and a perfect creation. It was just as puzzling to the Victorian scientists who were busy exploring and trying to make sense of the world.
I think science is basically the art of classifying the world. And with more or less sophistication, that's what it does. It tries to make order out of what seems like disorder. And nowhere is that more true than in biology. There are millions and millions of different kinds of creatures around, and it's a perfectly natural human instinct, like stamp collecting, to put them into categories. The Swedish biologist Linnaeus had come up with a mechanism for classifying them, which was basically completely arbitrary. It was a two-stage mechanism. You put them into large groups called genera and smaller groups called species, and it worked pretty well. However, what very quickly became obvious, and it was obvious to Darwin, that this wasn't like stamp collecting. You've got the one anthropony Tristan da Cunha 1952 black, or you don't. There are no intermediates. In evolution, there are intermediates, and that really is what concentrated Darwin's mind most of all. If life is classified, why isn't it easily classified? Why are the edges blurred? And he came to the idea that maybe the edges are blurred because species aren't absolute. They can change from one into the next.
But these variations, the blurring at the edges between one individual and another, seem to be made up of subtle differences. Slight variations in the size of the head, color, or shape of a wing. These seemingly continuous variations were very much at odds with the discrete changes that Mendel had observed. But Darwin was himself a great observer. He knew that the extraordinary variety that pigeon fanciers produced had all been achieved gradually. Breeders selecting the birds they wanted to mate together by paying detailed attention to the characteristics they wanted to emphasize, culling those in which those features were less developed. This rather draconian artificial selection acting to nudge these creatures on to yet more fantastic forms. But how? What was the mechanism? Careful measurements of variations between parents and offspring showed slight changes, changes that you could trace through the generations. So it's not difficult to see why he began to think of inheritance as a sort of blending of different characteristics. Nor is it difficult to see the problems inherent in the idea.
If it were the case that heredity really was a kind of mixing of two fluids, so that the offspring was always exactly intermediate between the parents as far as its genetic constitution was concerned, then it's fairly easy to see that the result of continuous interbreeding is that everybody becomes alike. Then you can't have evolution. And Darwin, when he realized this, was, I think, pretty disturbed about it.
What Mendel showed was that the genetic instructions are separate from what they make. And what we do to ourselves in terms of, let's say, sawing our feet off or being circumcised or whatever you like, makes no difference to the genes. So that separation of agent and product is what was central to Mendel's work. And Darwin had never really grasped that. He always thought that the attributes of the animals themselves, their bodies, their thoughts, their habits, were passed on to the next generation. That isn't true. Their genes are.
So whatever it is that specifies a feature of a living thing remains in some way distinct, separate from what gets made. Sometimes appearing in one generation, sometimes not to be seen for several to come. Add to this the occasional mutation that might produce some useful attribute, and you have a reasonable account of how species vary, change, and develop. When the full significance of this sunk in, it seemed that all Darwin's speculation about competition and natural selection had been fruitless. Couldn't evolutionary change be better explained by Mendelian genetics?
It took really from about the turn of the century until the great synthesis of Darwinism and Mendel in the 1930s to try to understand how you could relate the two. And what the new synthesis did, the modern synthesis did in the 1930s, was it showed I think fundamentally that Mendelian genetics could provide the basis for evolutionary change.
The key to the modern synthesis lay in the realization that genes actually work in very complex ways. For although Mendel had deliberately worked with simple characteristics, the color of the pea flower or the shape of its seeds, he knew that this convenient simplification would become more difficult as we tried to understand the laws of inheritance more widely.
The key to the answer to it is, in fact, in Mendel's paper, that most characters actually involve lots and lots and lots of genes. They are, in fact, polygenic. And you can add another little complication to that, that most genes actually have more than one effect. In other words, they're pleiotropic. And if you say that a human being has 100,000 genes and that God knows how many characters, as many as you care to count, then you can see that in real life the complexities are enormous, and in real life you can get gradual changes, just as Darwin said.
I think our current understanding of inheritance, to put it rather flippantly, is that Mendel was right, but life in fact is much more complicated than that. Nobody denies the basic fact of Mendelism, and the great triumph of molecular biology is to turn the sort of intellectual construct of Mendel about these particles, and he had no interest in what they were or where they might be found, to turn that into a real and rather tedious chemical called DNA.
By the 1930s, the ideas of Mendel and Darwin had been brought together in what's known as the modern synthesis, a comprehensive theory of inheritance and evolution. The missing piece of the puzzle was an understanding of the physical mechanism through which all this worked. Enter the third of those crucial figures working in the middle of the last century, the chemist Friedrich Miescher. Working with white blood cells taken from the bandages of casualties of the Franco-Prussian War, he was the first to identify what we now know as DNA, and the first to speculate that these large molecules might have something to do with the way in which inheritance gets handed on through the generations. Hindsight would mark Dr. Miescher as a rather clever man.
I was taught genetics in the first year of university course in 1945, and there was no DNA. I mean, DNA existed, it was known to exist, but it was thought of as a kind of skeletal material which held the chromosomes together, and the genes were thought probably to be made of protein. Nobody really knew. Genes were just rather mysterious entities which in some totally unknown way caused differences between organisms.
DNA is inside the nucleus and just wrapped up in a lot of proteins. What we have to do is crack open the cells and burst the nucleus and take the proteins off the DNA. Take a leaflet, put it in a tube, and freeze it.
DNA is, if you like, one of the commonest and most standard chemical which can be isolated from any tissue, whether it's yeast, whether it's peas, whether it's humans, whether it's any other living form.
What I'm going to do now is add the phenol. I will make an emulsion by shaking the phenol with the buffer.
Because it's such an inert molecule, it's relatively easy to extract. It withstands all sorts of pressures, all sorts of boiling activities and so on, which would kill every protein in the tissue. You can pull it out, rather like you can pull a strand of cotton or a strand of nylon out. And what you're really pulling out is in fact a spun thread of DNA.
I think the most remarkable thing about DNA is that there's a lot of it about. I contain within myself millions of miles of DNA. Now, the thing which is remarkable is that all those millions of miles come from the 6 feet of DNA which were in the fertilized egg that made me. So DNA is a remarkable and complicated chemical, but in the end, it's just a machinery for transmitting information.
Nowadays, isolating DNA is a routine laboratory procedure. But understanding its structure and the way it provides the physical mechanism through which evolution occurs has been the single most important discovery in the lifetimes of most biologists working today.
In the early 50s, James Watson and Francis Crick had described the three-dimensional structure of DNA. So that instead of now thinking of genes as being sort of like beads on a string, as being abstractions, one could actually think of them as real pieces of chemistry. And at the end of the 50s, people were beginning to work out how the genetic code worked, and were beginning to work out how genes got switched on and switched off. Now you put all these things together, how genes get switched on and switched off, how the code works, and then put that with classical genetics, and then put that with Darwin's evolution, and it looks as if you've got a complete explanation for all of life. And actually you more or less have, to be honest.
It was an enormous liberation. Reading, I can still remember the excitement of reading Watson and Crick's paper. And it has this famous last sentence that I can't exactly remember, but it says something like, "It has not escaped our attention that this structure may have some significance for the nature of inheritance." I mean, it's one of those throwaway lines at the end. And it did. I mean, you just saw that structure and you thought, well, of course, you know, that's what it is. And very exciting it was too.
In many ways, the wheel has turned full circle. Researchers are now mapping and cataloguing the vast human genome. As painstaking and detailed a task as the great 19th century naturalists' endeavours to catalogue the hundreds and thousands of new species they were discovering. And grafting genetics onto the theory of natural selection has been one of the great scientific adventures of the century. The insights of Darwin and Mendel have been reconciled, and along with our growing understanding of the mechanisms of inheritance, lie at the heart of modern biology. This, coupled with the realization that the Earth is much older than anyone in Darwin's time could imagine, all help explain the appearance of you and me, and the exquisite complexity of the organs upon which we all depend.
Evolutionary time is immense, starting from a very, very simple proto-eye. You work step by step, inch by inch, up the slopes of the mountain. That means that the eye is gradually improving, gradually becoming more elaborate, until you reach the top. And when you reach the top, the eye is complicated enough to inspire you with incredulity at the thought that it could possibly have come about by chance. And of course, it hasn't come about by chance. It's come about by the non-random process of step-by-step cumulative natural selection.
Here's a look at what's coming up in business on BBC Learning.